I endured an abusive marriage until I decided to leave, and my husband said he will marry another woman if I do. I was the head girl of my school, smart, ambitious, and full of dreams. My teachers praised me, my classmates respected me, and I had every intention of becoming someone great. Until Mr. Obina changed my life forever. He was the mathematics teacher, strict but respected. The type of man everyone feared and admired at the same time. He had a way of speaking with authority that made students sit up straight. But behind that controlled exterior was a predator. One afternoon, just after closing time, he called me aside. Dan, he said, his deep voice firm but calm. I need you to help me with something. I nodded immediately. Teachers often sent prefects on errands, and I didn't think anything of it. I left some important books in my apartment, he continued. Run along and fetch them for me. My house isn't far. I hesitated for a second. I had never been sent to a teacher's house before. But who was I to refuse? Saying no to a teacher, especially one like him, could mean trouble. I took the address and walked the short distance to his apartment. It was a small, well-arranged space that smelled of strong aftershave and soap. I spotted the books he mentioned on a table near the window and was about to grab them when I heard the door close behind me. A slow dread crept up my spine. I turned around to see him leaning against the door, staring at me with an expression I didn't understand. It wasn't the stern face he wore in class. It was something else, something unsettling. Good girl, he murmured. You're obedient. I clutched the books tightly. Sir, I've gotten the books. I should be going now. He took a step forward. Not so fast. The air became thick. My heartbeat quickened. Something was terribly wrong. Come here, Dan, he commanded. I shook my head. Sir, Now. His voice was sharp, cutting through my resistance like a knife. I tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed me, his grip ironclad. I fought, I screamed, I pleaded, but no one came. The walls swallowed my cries. And just like that, my life changed. The days after that night were a blur. I walked through school like a ghost, my body present, but my spirit shattered. I avoided Mr. Obina's eyes in class, but he watched me, knowing he had won. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but who would believe me? Who would fight for me? Then, a few weeks later, I missed my period. At first, I convinced myself it was stress, but the nausea came next, then the dizziness, then the undeniable swelling of my belly. I was pregnant. I remember the way my mother's face twisted when she found out. The disappointment in her eyes burned more than any slap ever could. My father didn't say much. He just sat there rubbing his bald head, his silence louder than her screams. Who is responsible? My mother demanded. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Mr. Obina. The room went deathly silent. When my father finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. Your teacher. I nodded, eyes glued to the floor. The next morning, my parents took me to his house. My father knocked so hard the door trembled. Mr. Obina opened it, looking irritated until he saw me standing behind them, my belly barely noticeable but my shame evident. She's pregnant, my mother spat. His face barely changed. He glanced at me, then sighed like he had expected this. So, what do you want me to do? You will marry her, my father said. My breath caught in my throat. No, I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. Marriage? To him? The man who had stolen my innocence? But in the eyes of my parents, there was no other choice. I was pregnant, and in our society, that meant one thing, marriage. My education didn't matter. My dreams didn't matter. What mattered was avoiding disgrace. The wedding was rushed. No fanfare, no celebration. Just a simple ceremony to cover the shame of an unmarried pregnant girl. I remember standing beside him, my hands shaking as the priest spoke words I barely heard. I was only 17, too young to drink, too young to vote, yet old enough to be someone's wife. As he slid the ring onto my trembling finger, I felt the cold weight of my stolen future. And just like that, I became Mrs. Obina. Marriage was supposed to mean safety, love, and companionship. For me, it meant a prison, a lifetime sentence to a man I despised. From the first night, it was clear that my suffering had only begun. There was no tenderness, no patience, only his entitlement to my body. The way he loomed over me, the smell of sweat and alcohol on his breath, the weight of him crushing me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to be over. It was never over. The days blurred into weeks, the weeks into months. I was barely more than a child, yet I had to cook, clean, and take care of a home that felt more like a grave. When I was too slow or too tired, his hands reminded me of my place. A slap here, a punch there, a shove that sent me crashing to the floor. When my baby was born, I thought things would change. I hoped that fatherhood would soften him, that he would see me not just as a wife, but as the mother of his child. But if anything, it got worse. You think because you have a child, you can disrespect me, he hissed one evening when I hesitated to bring him food. Before I could explain, his hand met my cheek, sending me tumbling. I held my baby close, rocking her gently, whispering that everything would be okay, even when I knew it was a lie. The cycle continued. The more children I bore him, the more I suffered. By the time I had 4, I had mastered the art of silence. I learned to flinch before the slap came. I learned to hide bruises with layers of makeup and forced smiles. People saw me in the market, walking beside my husband, carrying my children, and they admired me. They thought I was lucky to have a man providing for me. They didn't see the fear in my eyes, the way I flinched at sudden movements, the way my body had become a battlefield of scars and pain. I stayed because of my children. I told myself I had to endure, that they needed both parents. But deep down, I knew. I was just too scared to leave. And fear, I realized, is the most unbreakable chain of all. I convinced myself that I was staying for my children. If I left, who would take care of them? How would they survive? A woman leaving her husband was a disgrace, an abomination. People would mock me. My family would turn their backs on me. And worst of all, my children might suffer. So I stayed. I learned to navigate his moods like a soldier walking through a field of landmines. If he came home and his eyes were bloodshot, I knew he had been drinking. That meant silence. I would not speak unless spoken to. If his steps were heavy, I knew he was angry, and I would make sure his food was hot, his bath was ready, and his face was clear. Anything to avoid his fists. But it didn't always work. One evening, I was feeding my youngest son when Obina came home, slamming the door so hard the baby startled and wailed. I froze. His eyes found me, and in an instant I knew I had done something wrong. "What is this nonsense?" he barked, pointing at the food on the table. "It's your favorite," I whispered, my hands shaking as I reached for his plate. Egusi soup and pounded yam. His lip curled. "So, you think I don't know my own food? You think I'm a fool?" I knew better than to argue. The slap came so fast I didn't see it. Pain exploded across my face, and I hit the ground, my baby still in my arms. I curled around him, shielding him from his father's rage. My other children watched from the corner, their faces pale with fear, too afraid to cry. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but what could I do? I told myself this was love, that a woman must endure, that I was doing this for my children. But one day, my eldest daughter, Ada, changed everything. She was 10 when she came to me in the kitchen, her small hands twisting the hem of her dress. "Mama," she whispered, "will I marry a man like Papa when I grow up?" My heart stopped. I turned to her, searching her innocent face, and in that moment I saw the truth. My daughter, my beautiful, smart, kind daughter, thought this was normal. She thought it was okay for a man to hit his wife. She believed that this was what marriage looked like. Something inside me cracked. I had stayed for them, but by staying, I was teaching them that suffering was love. I was showing my sons that it was okay to hurt a woman. I was teaching my daughters that they had no right to happiness. I had become the very thing I feared, an example of weakness. That night, as I lay beside my monster of a husband, staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I would leave. No matter what it took, no matter what he said, no matter what the world thought of me, I would leave. Because if I didn't, I would not only lose myself, but I would lose my children too. And that I could not bear. The night I finally decided to leave began like any other, except this time, I knew it would be my last. Obina came home late, reeking of beer and sweat. I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep, but I heard him stumbling around, knocking things over. My body tensed as I waited. "A Dan," he bellowed. I swallowed hard, forcing myself up. If I delayed, it would only make things worse. I stepped into the sitting room to find him slumped on the couch, his shirt half open, his eyes red and unfocused. "Where's my food?" he slurred. "It's in the kitchen," I whispered, careful not to sound annoyed. "I'll bring it." I rushed to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I scooped the food onto a plate. But by the time I returned, he was standing. His mood had shifted. "Do you think I don't know what you're planning?" His voice was low, dangerous. My heart pounded. "What do you mean?" He staggered toward me, grabbing my arm with a grip so tight I gasped. "I see the way you've changed. You think you can leave me, ABI." Fear shot through me like lightning. Had he been listening? Had I spoken my thoughts out loud? I haven't. The slap cut my words short. My head snapped to the side, my vision blurred. Before I could recover, his fists followed. Blow after blow. My ribs screamed. My face burned. My knees buckled. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Blood trickled from my lip. My children, my babies stood at the door, wide-eyed and trembling. "Go back inside." I tried to shout, but my voice was weak. Then he grabbed me by my hair and slammed my head against the wall. Crack. White-hot pain exploded in my skull. The room spun. My ears rang. For a moment, I thought I was going to die. I lay there, dazed, waiting for the darkness to swallow me. But then, I heard his voice, sharp and mocking. "If you leave, I will marry another woman immediately." That was it. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I wasn't crying. I wasn't begging. I wasn't even afraid anymore. Instead, a cold, fierce anger settled in my chest. Let him marry another woman. Let him do whatever he wanted. I didn't care anymore. I was leaving. And this time, nothing, not his threats, not my fears, not even society's judgment was going to stop me. I wiped the blood from my mouth, pulled myself up, and limped to my children's room. They huddled together, frightened. I knelt before them, cupping their faces, kissing their foreheads. "Pack your things," I whispered. That night, under the cover of darkness, with nothing but a small bag of clothes and the determination burning in my chest, I walked out of that house. For the first time in years, I was free. I stepped out into the night with my children clinging to me, their tiny hands gripping my dress as if afraid I would disappear. The air was thick and still, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, watching me take my first step toward freedom. I didn't know where I was going. I had no money, no plan, and no place to sleep. But I knew one thing, I was never going back. We walked in silence, my heart pounding at every shadow that moved. I feared Obinna would wake up, realize we were gone, and come after us. Every sound made me flinch, but I kept walking, forcing one foot in front of the other. By the time we reached the main road, my youngest son was whimpering from exhaustion. I hoisted him onto my hip, despite the pain in my ribs, and kept going. I needed help. There was only one person I could think of, Auntie Ngozi. She was my mother's distant cousin, a widow who lived on the outskirts of town. We weren't close, but she had always been kind to me when I was younger. I prayed she wouldn't turn me away. By the time we reached her house, my legs were trembling. I knocked weakly, barely able to keep my eyes open. The door creaked open, and Auntie Ngozi's eyes widened in shock. "A Dan!" Her gaze swept over me. The bruises, the blood, the terrified children. Without hesitation, she pulled us inside. She didn't ask questions at first. She simply sat me down, gave the children food, and handed me a wrapper to clean myself. Only after I had sipped some warm tea did she speak. "Did he do this to you?" I nodded, fresh tears spilling down my cheeks. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You should have left him long ago." I looked away. I was scared. She placed a hand on mine. "You're safe now." Safe. I had forgotten what that word felt like. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without fear. I didn't have to brace myself for the sound of footsteps approaching my bed. I didn't have to flinch at the weight of a man forcing himself on me. I curled up beside my children, listening to their steady breathing, and let the exhaustion drag me under. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of fried plantains and eggs. Auntie Ngozi had made breakfast, and my children were eating happily. It was a sight so simple yet so beautiful that I almost cried again. But as I watched them, a new thought took root in my mind. I had left Obina. But was that enough? What kind of life could I give my children now? I had no job, no skills, and no education. Would we live like beggars, depending on the kindness of relatives? Would I fail them just as I had failed myself? No. I had made one brave choice. Now, it was time to make another. I was going to rebuild my life. I was going to work, learn, and become a woman who could stand on her own 2 feet. I didn't just want to survive. I wanted to rise. Waking up in Auntie Ngozi's house felt strange. The air was calm, free of tension. My body still ached from the beating, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what the day would bring. But as I looked around the small room, reality settled in. I had 4 children to feed. I had escaped Obina, but what next? I couldn't stay with Auntie Ngozi forever. She was kind, but she had her own struggles. She sold vegetables in the market and barely made enough for herself. I had to figure something out. After breakfast, I sat outside with her. The morning sun was warm, but my heart was heavy. Auntie, I need to work, I said. I don't want to be a burden. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. What can you do? I hesitated. I don't know. I had spent my entire life being a wife, a mother, a punching bag, but never a woman with dreams or skills. She sighed. There's a woman at the market, Mama Chidima. She sells food and always needs extra hands. It's not much, but it's a start. A start. It was better than nothing. That same day, I followed Auntie Ngozi to the market. The air was thick with the smell of fried meat, ripe fruits, and fresh fish. Voices called out in Igbo, bargaining, laughing, arguing. It was loud and chaotic, but it was alive. Mama Chidima was a plump woman with a loud voice and sharp eyes. She barely looked at me before saying, "You go pound yam, wash plates, and serve customers. No laziness. If you work well, I will pay you every week." I nodded eagerly. I will work hard. And I did. From morning till night, I pounded yam until my arms ached, scrubbed pots until my fingers wrinkled, and ran back and forth serving customers. Sweat drenched my clothes. My feet throbbed. But every night, I went home with a few naira in my pocket and food for my children. It wasn't much, but it was mine. One evening, as I wiped sweat from my forehead, Mama Chidima sat beside me. "You work hard," she said, "but this kind of work won't take you far. Have you thought about learning a skill?" I frowned. "A skill?" She nodded. "Hairdressing, tailoring, catering, something that will bring you more money." I had never thought about it before. But now that she said it, I realized if I wanted to truly escape poverty, I couldn't just survive. I had to grow. That night, I sat with Auntie Ngozi and told her what Mama Chidima had said. She smiled. "She's right," she said. "And I know just the place." The next day, she took me to a small shop where women sat on low stools, braiding hair with nimble fingers. The owner, a woman named Sister Esther, welcomed me with open arms. "You want to learn?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my voice firm. She smiled. "Then come early tomorrow. You will start as an apprentice." A new journey had begun. For the first time in years, I wasn't just trying to escape my past. I was building a future. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. My body still ached from the years of abuse, and my hands were rough from pounding yam at the market, but I didn't care. I had something to look forward to, something that was mine. I left my children in Auntie Ngozi's care and hurried to Sister Esther's shop. The air was crisp, the streets still waking up. When I arrived, the other apprentices were already there, their fingers busy weaving, twisting, and parting hair. Sister Esther handed me a mannequin head and a comb. "Start with this," she said. "Let me see how your hands work." I had never braided before, but I watched the others mimicking their movements. My first attempts were clumsy, too tight, too loose, uneven. The other women giggled, but Sister Esther only nodded. "You'll get better," she said. "Patience." And so I practiced. Every day, I spent hours at the shop, watching, learning, and braiding until my fingers cramped. In the evenings, I went to the market to work for Mama Chidima. I barely had time to rest, but I didn't complain. Slowly, I improved. One afternoon, a woman walked into the shop with her daughter. She pointed at me. Let her braid my daughter's hair. My heart pounded. This was my first real client. I hesitated, looking at Sister Esther, but she gave me an encouraging nod. I picked up the comb, my hands trembling, and started parting the girl's hair. Asterisk, make it neat. Make it tight, but not painful. Asterisk. It took longer than it should have, and my fingers ached by the time I was done. But when the woman saw her daughter's hair, she smiled. Good job, she said, pressing a few naira notes into my palm. My first earning from my new skill. My first step towards something greater. As the weeks passed, I became better, faster. Soon, I was handling more clients, earning small amounts here and there. It wasn't much, but it was enough to feed my children without depending on anyone. One evening, as I was packing up to leave, Sister Esther called me aside. You work hard, Adan, she said. You remind me of myself when I started. I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. She continued, have you thought about expanding? Maybe learning how to fix weaves, how to do bridal hair. The more you know, the more you earn. I hadn't thought about it before. But now that she said it, the idea excited me. I nodded. Yes, I want to learn more. She smiled. Then I'll teach you. That night, as I walked home, something dawned on me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was growing. For years, I had been trapped in a marriage that took everything from me. Now, I was slowly taking back control. And for the first time, I believed that a better future was possible. 2 years had passed since I left Obina, and in those 2 years, I had rebuilt my life piece by piece. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled me. My hands were stronger from braiding hair and working in the market. My children were thriving, happy, and safe. And I was becoming someone new, someone I didn't recognize but was proud of. But even with everything I had accomplished, I was still lonely. I had been so consumed with surviving, with making sure my children had food and a roof over their heads, that I had forgotten what it was like to feel desired, loved. The thought of opening my heart again scared me, but it also tugged at me. Could I ever trust another man? Could I even allow myself to feel anything for someone after all the pain I had been through? It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I had finished a long day of work at Sister Esther's shop and was heading home when I saw him, Emeka. He was standing outside a small shop, talking to one of the vendors. His voice was deep, rich with authority, and it made me stop for a moment. His presence was commanding, yet there was something kind in his eyes. He saw me staring and smiled. It was warm, unguarded, and for some reason my heart skipped a beat. Good evening, he said, his voice smooth. I'm Emeka. I nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious. Adan. He smiled again, his eyes studying me with interest. You're new around here? I shifted uneasily. I've been around, just not in this part of town much. Emeka's gaze softened, sensing my discomfort. I've seen you before. You're the one who does hair, right? I froze. How did you know? He shrugged casually. I've heard people talking. You've got a reputation for being good. The compliment caught me off guard. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to me like that. Not out of pity or obligation, but genuinely. I was used to being seen as a mother, a survivor, but not as a woman. I cleared my throat, trying to sound normal. I work hard. Hard work is always impressive, he said with a grin. I'm sure your customers appreciate it. Something about his easy manner, his sincerity, made me feel at ease. We talked for a few more minutes, and when it was time to leave, Emeka asked for my number. I'd like to see you again, he said. Maybe we can have dinner sometime. I was hesitant. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. He raised an eyebrow. Why not? You deserve a break, Adan. I looked at him unsure. Could I let someone else into my life, after everything? After what I had been through? But then I remembered the nights I spent alone, the longing that I could never quite shake. Okay, I finally said. Dinner. One time. He grinned, and my heart skipped again. The dinner date was nothing like I expected. Emeka was charming, but not in a way that made me uncomfortable. He asked questions, but not the kind of questions that pried into my past too deeply. He was genuinely interested in my life, my work, my children, my dreams. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was seen for who I was, not just the woman who had suffered. As the night went on, I found myself laughing, something I hadn't done in years. We talked about everything, from childhood memories to the best jollof rice in town. It was easy, effortless, and for the first time, I felt like I was allowed to just be me. By the end of the evening, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed myself. I had expected to be anxious, to want to run away. But Emeka had a way of making me feel comfortable, of making me believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have a future that didn't involve pain and fear. As he walked me home, he took my hand and I didn't pull away. The gesture was simple, but it felt like a promise, like a glimpse into something that could be real. But just as I began to believe in the possibility of something new, the reality of my past came crashing back. Obinna, would he try to come back into my life? Would he hurt me again? I couldn't forget what he had done, couldn't forget how much I had sacrificed just to escape his violence. Emeka must have sensed my unease. Adan, he said softly, his voice gentle. I know it's not easy, but you don't have to do this alone. You've already fought so much to get here, and I respect that. His words sank in, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. Maybe I could have a second chance at love. Maybe there was someone out there who could love me without hurting me. But it wouldn't be easy. The scars of my past were deep, and healing would take time. Yet for the first time, I felt like I could take that step forward. Emeka squeezed my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace.